The Dragon of the East, Kang Tae-Joon, sat at the head of a mahogany table, his dark eyes scanning the room with a calm but dangerous aura. In this world, dinner wasn't just a meal, it was a minefield. His broad shoulders were squared, his black suit tailored to perfection, as he lifted his silver fork to take a bite of the glazed duck. But before the silver could touch his lips, he felt the ghost of a touch on his sleeve. Not a waiter. Not an assassin. Just a small, trembling hand. Tae-Joon froze. His men reacted with lethal instinct, hands reaching for the holsters hidden beneath their jackets. Too fast, too aggressive. But with a slight raise of his ringed finger, Tae-Joon stopped them dead. He looked down to see a girl who looked no older than 6, her light brown hair tied in neat braids, her soft pink dress a splash of innocence against the grim black of his security detail. She wasn't supposed to be here. No one eludes Tae-Joon's guards. Yet here she was, leaning in close, her large, curious eyes filled with a terrifying weight. She didn't ask for money. She didn't ask for mercy. Instead, she cupped her tiny hand around his ear and let out a breathy, urgent whisper that made the most powerful man in the city turn cold. "Don't eat that yet," she breathed. Tae-Joon lowered his fork, his sharp jaw tightening. He looked at the girl, then at the associates, sitting across from him, whose furrowed brows suddenly betrayed their panic. "Why not, little one?" Tae-Joon asked, his voice a low, commanding rumble. She leaned closer, her voice trembling but certain. "Because if you do, the man in the kitchen said my mommy won't come home." That's when Tae-Joon noticed the smudge of flour on her sleeve and the way she kept glancing at the high-ranking general sitting to his right. The Mafia boss slowly set his silverware down, not because he was afraid of the food, but because a child had just handed him the keys to his own survival. "Stay with me until the end, because the secret this little girl whispered next would ignite a war that scorched the city's underworld to the ground." Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get started. Tae-Joon didn't move a muscle, but the air in the room curdled. The silence was so heavy it felt as though the oxygen had been sucked out of the chamber, replaced by the metallic tang of impending violence. He looked at the girl, Ha-Eun, whose hand was still hovering near his ear. Her eyes were wide, pleading, fixed on his with a desperate sincerity that no assassin could fake. Slowly, Tae-Joon's gaze drifted to the man sitting at his right hand, General Oh. The older man was a veteran of 100 street wars, a pillar of the organization, yet a microscopic bead of sweat was beginning to trace a path down his temple. "Is there a problem, Chairman?" Oh asked, his voice a fraction too controlled. Tae-Joon didn't answer. Instead, he pushed his plate of glazed duck toward the center of the table. "I've lost my appetite for poultry," he said, his tone as smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. He beckoned to one of the enforcers standing by the door, a man named Kyo, who had been seen whispering with Oh's subordinates earlier that evening. "Kyo, come here." The guard stepped forward, his boots clicking rhythmically on the marble floor. He looked at the plate, then at Tae-Joon. "Sir? This meal is a masterpiece," Tae-Joon murmured, his dark eyes hooded. "It would be a shame to waste it." "Eat." The room held its breath. Kyo hesitated for a heartbeat too long, his eyes darting toward General Oh. The general's face remained a mask of stone, offering no salvation. With trembling hands, the guard picked up the silver fork. He took a small, hesitant bite. For 5 seconds, nothing happened. Then, his eyes rolled back, his throat convulsed in a sickening, strangled wet sound, and he collapsed. The plate shattered on the floor, the porcelain shards mixing with the poisoned meat. "Traitor!" Tae-Joon whispered. Chaos erupted. General Oh lunged for the pistol tucked into his waistband, but Tae-Joon was faster. He didn't use a gun. He flipped the heavy mahogany table with a roar of concentrated fury, the massive wood slamming into the conspirators across from him. Gunshots rang out, shattering the crystal chandeliers and plunging the room into a strobe-light nightmare of muzzle flashes and screams. In the middle of the carnage, Tae-Joon felt a small weight press against his side. Ha-Eun hadn't run. She had tucked herself under his suit jacket, her small hands clutching his waist. She was the only thing in this room that wasn't trying to kill him. Tae-Joon pulled his own weapon, his thumb clicking the safety off with a mechanical finality. He shielded the girl's head with his broad hand, pressing her face into his chest so she wouldn't see the blood that was about to paint the walls. "Close your eyes, Ha-Eun," he commanded, his voice no longer a rumble, but a growl of war. "The lion is out of his cage." The ringing in the room was no longer the sound of fine crystal, but the high-pitched hum of spent shell casings and fading screams. Tae-Joon stood amidst the wreckage, his suit jacket singed, his hands still resting protectively over Ha-Eun's light brown braids. His men had secured the perimeter, their shadows long and jagged against the bullet-pocked walls. General Oh had vanished into the smoke of the initial burst, leaving behind only the cold corpse of the guard who had tasted the chairman's death. Tae-Joon felt a tug on his vest. He looked down into the large, shimmering eyes of the girl who had just rewritten his destiny. Her face was pale, but she wasn't screaming. She possessed the eerie, quiet shock of someone who had seen too much, too young. "The kitchen," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the heavy breathing of the armed men surrounding them. "I have to go back to the kitchen. Mommy is waiting." Tae-Joon knelt, his knees cracking in the sudden silence. He ignored the blood on the floor, focusing entirely on the small girl in the pink dress. "Ha-Eun, look at me," he said, his sharp features softening into a look of intense focus. "The man who put the powder on my plate, what did you see?" She swallowed hard, her small hands twisting the fabric of her dress. "I was hiding in the pantry. I was playing a game, waiting for Mommy to finish the sauces. Then a man came in. He didn't look like the other cooks. He wore a black mask that covered his nose and mouth, like a shadow." She mimicked the shape of a mask with her hands, her fingers trembling. "He had a little silver jar. He was dusting the plates, making them look pretty," he said. "But he was only doing it to yours." Tae-Joon's jaw tightened. A mask. An outsider in his own sanctuary? This wasn't just a betrayal. It was an infiltration. "Did he see you?" "He saw me," she breathed, her voice cracking. "He caught me by the arm. He told me if I said a word to the big man at the table, Mommy would go to sleep and never wake up. He said they were taking her to a place where the sun doesn't shine." A cold, familiar fury settled into Tae-Joon's bones. He realized then that Ha-Eun hadn't just been brave, she had defied a death threat to save a man she didn't even know. She had traded her mother's immediate safety for a gamble on a Mafia boss's honor. Tae-Joon reached out, his large, callous thumb gently brushing a stray tear from her cheek. He stood up, his towering frame casting a shadow over the room once more. He looked at his second-in-command, his eyes turning back into the dark, focused orbs of a predator. "Scour the CCTV. Find every entrance to the service tunnels," Tae-Joon commanded. "The shadow didn't just walk in here alone. And find out where they keep people when they want the sun to stop shining." He looked back at Ha-Eun and held out his hand. "Your mother isn't going to sleep, Ha-Eun. Not tonight. Not on my watch." Tae-Joon strode toward the back of the restaurant, his hand gripping Ha-Eun's small palm with a firmness that promised safety. His enforcers fanned out ahead of them, their tactical lights slicing through the dim, industrial hallways. The usual roar of a world-class kitchen, the clatter of copper pans, the shouting of orders, the hiss of blue flames, had been replaced by a hollow, terrifying stillness. When they crossed the threshold into the heart of the kitchen, the air smelled of scorched garlic and abandoned dreams. A pot of sauce was still simmering on a back burner, sending up a thin, lonely plume of steam. "Mommy?" Ha-Eun called out, her voice echoing off the stainless steel walls. There was no answer. Tae-Joon scanned the room with a practiced, predatory eye. On the prep station, a chef's knife lay on the floor, and a tray of garnish had been overturned, the delicate microgreens crushed under the tread of heavy boots. There were no signs of a struggle that would have been heard in the dining room, only the surgical efficiency of a professional abduction. Ha-Eun pulled her hand from his and ran toward a small stool in the corner where a pink sweater hung over the back. She clutched the fabric to her chest, her small shoulders beginning to shake. "She's gone." The shadow man took her. Tae-Joon stepped over to the prep table. Beside a half-chopped onion lay a single, obsidian black coin, the calling card of the Silent Hand, a mercenary group that worked exclusively for those looking to topple empires. By leaving the coin, they weren't just taking a chef, they were taunting the dragon. One of Tae-Joon's men approached, bowing his head. "Chairman, the back service exit was jammed from the outside. The security feeds for the last 10 minutes have been looped. They were in and out before the first course was served." Tae-Joon looked at the girl. She looked so small against the backdrop of his violent world, a splash of soft pink in a room built of cold steel and blood. He had spent his life viewing people as chess pieces, moving them or sacrificing them to maintain his board. But as Ha-Eun looked up at him, her large eyes searching his for a miracle, something in his chest, a part of him he thought had died in the slums decades ago, throbbed with a painful, sudden life. He realized then that the girl was no longer just a witness. She was his debt. By saving his life, she had handed him her own, and in the rules of the underworld, there was no greater obligation. "Secure the sweater," Tae-Joon commanded, his voice vibrating with a low, dangerous frequency. "And get the car ready. She stays with me." He walked over to Ha-Eun and picked her up, her light frame weighing almost nothing against his broad chest. She buried her face in his neck, her tears dampening his silk tie. "I want my mommy," she sobbed quietly. "I know," Tae-Joon whispered, his gaze turning toward the darkened exit. "And I'm going to tear this city apart until I find her." The black sedan moved through the rain-slicked streets like a silent shark, the interior illuminated only by the cold, blue glow of digital tablets. Ha-Eun had finally fallen into a fitful sleep against the leather seat, her small hand still gripping the hem of Tae-Joon's suit jacket. Tae-Joon, however, was far from rest. He watched the city lights blur past, his mind a battlefield of shifting loyalties and shattered trust. "The toxin," his lead chemist reported over an encrypted line, his voice crackling with unease. "It wasn't a street chemical, Chairman. It was VX4, a military-grade nerve agent. Only 3 shipments have entered the country in the last year. All of them were intercepted and stored in our private warehouse." Tae-Joon's grip tightened on the armrest until the leather groaned. The message was unmistakable. The poison hadn't come from a rival's laboratory, it had come from his own vault. The shadow man in the kitchen hadn't broken into the sanctuary, he had been let in. "Bring me the logs," Tae-Joon commanded, his voice a low, lethal vibration. "Every man who had access to the southern depot. Every guard on duty during the dinner rotation. I want their bank statements, their call histories, and the names of their mistresses." The paranoia began to settle in his gut like lead. He looked out the window, seeing ghosts in every shadow. If his own logistics team was compromised, if his own security had blinked, then the walls of his empire were no longer stone, they were glass. He glanced at the rearview mirror, meeting the eyes of his driver, a man who had served him for a decade. For the first time, Tae-Joon wondered if the hand on the steering wheel was waiting for the right moment to veer into a bridge. "Chairman," his advisor whispered from the front seat. "General O's signal went dark near the docks. But before he vanished, he made one outgoing call. To your head of security." The betrayal was a jagged blade turning in his chest. His head of security, the man who knew his schedules, his weaknesses, and his safe houses, was the one who had cleared the path for the masked man. The realization made the air in the car feel thin. He wasn't just fighting an enemy, he was fighting his own shadow. He looked down at Ha-Eun, her innocent face a stark contrast to the rot in his organization. To save her mother, he would have to burn his house down and rebuild it from the ashes. Every face he knew was now a mask. Every "Yes, sir," was a potential lie. "Change the destination," Tae-Joon said, his eyes darkening with a clinical, cold resolve. "We aren't going to the estate. If the wolves are already inside the den, we find a new place to hide." The penthouse was a fortress of glass and cold marble, perched so high above the city that the streetlights looked like dying embers. It was a place designed for a man who lived alone and expected to die that way. As Tae-Joon set Ha-Eun down on the white leather sofa, the silence of the room felt more oppressive than the gunfire had been. He stood there, a giant in a tailored suit, looking down at the small girl who was currently the only person in the world he could trust. Ha-Eun rubbed her eyes, looking around the minimalist space. There were no toys, no colors, and nothing that suggested a human actually lived there. Her bottom lip trembled. "Is my mommy here?" Tae-Joon stiffened. He could negotiate multi-billion-dollar territories and stare down the barrel of a gun without blinking, but this question made his pulse spike. He cleared his throat, trying to find a frequency in his voice that wasn't a command. "No," he said, the word coming out shorter than he intended. He tried again, softening his tone. "Not yet. This is a secure location. You'll stay here while I work." "I'm hungry," she whispered, her voice small and fragile. Tae-Joon realized with a jolt of panic that he had no idea what children ate. His kitchen contained aged scotch, espresso beans, and a single bottle of expensive sparkling water. He walked to the sleek, stainless steel refrigerator and opened it, hoping for a miracle. He found nothing but a jar of olives and a tray of ice. He turned back to find her watching him, her large, curious eyes tracking his every move. He felt a bead of sweat prickle his neck. "I will have my men bring noodles. Or perhaps sandwiches? Mommy makes me warm milk when I'm scared," she said, clutching the pink sweater she'd salvaged from the restaurant. Tae-Joon looked at his hands, hands that had broken bones and signed death warrants, and felt a sudden, sharp inadequacy. He walked over and sat on the edge of the coffee table, maintaining a distance he hoped was respectful rather than cold. "I don't have milk, Ha-Eun. But I give you my word. No one comes through that door. I am the strongest man in the city, and right now, my only job is you." She looked at him for a long time, scanning his sharp jawline and the intense, focused energy in his eyes. Slowly, she leaned forward and placed her small hand over his ringed finger. "You look sad, Mr. Lion," she whispered. The comment hit him like a physical blow. He didn't know how to respond to kindness, especially the unfiltered kind. He stood up abruptly, his suspicion warring with a burgeoning, unfamiliar warmth. "Sleep on the sofa? I have calls to make." As he walked toward his balcony to check his perimeter, he realized the stakes had shifted. He wasn't just defending a throne anymore. He was defending the only person who had ever looked at him and seen something other than a monster. The silence of the penthouse was shattered not by a sound from the city below, but by the vibration of a burner phone Tae-Joon had recovered from the dining room wreckage. He stepped away from the glass, his shadow stretching long across the marble floor as he pressed the device to his ear. He didn't speak. He waited, his jaw set like granite. "The air is quite thin up there, isn't it, Chairman?" The voice was unmistakable. General O. But the polished, subservient tone was gone, replaced by the jagged edge of a man who had already committed to his treason. "You're a hard man to kill, Tae-Joon," O continued, his breathing heavy through the line. "But you've made a fatal mistake. You've let your heart lead you to a safe house I helped you build. Did you really think changing the destination would save you?" Tae-Joon's dark eyes flickered to the heavy steel door of the penthouse. He didn't show fear. he showed teeth. You should have stayed in the shadows, oh. Now I don't have to look for you. A brave sentiment. But let's discuss the price of your survival. Oh countered. A muffled sob echoed in the background, a woman's voice, sharp with terror. Tae-Joon felt Ha-Eun stir on the sofa behind him, her small body tensing at the sound. The girl's mother is currently sitting over a vat of industrial lye. She's been very cooperative, but my patience is as thin as your loyalty to our traditions. Tae-Joon's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles turned white. What do you want? Exchange. The girl for the mother. Oh said, his voice dropping to a cold whisper. She's the only witness left who can testify to who poisoned that plate. Bring her to the old iron foundry at the docks. 1 hour. If I see a single one of your enforcers, the mother goes into the chemicals. If you don't show up, I'll send the girl her mother's wedding ring, and nothing else. The line went dead. Tae-Joon turned to look at Ha-Eun. She was sitting up now, clutching her pink sweater, her large eyes fixed on him with a haunting intuition. She had heard the sob. She knew the Shadow Man was bargaining with her life. The internal struggle was a physical pain in Tae-Joon's chest. His empire demanded he stay and fight. His logic told him the girl was just a civilian, a liability. But then he remembered the tiny hand on his sleeve and the whisper that had saved his breath. He wasn't just a boss anymore. He was a man with a debt that couldn't be paid in gold. He walked over to his weapon locker, pulling out a heavy tactical vest and his custom .45 caliber. Mr. Lion? Ha-Eun whispered, her voice trembling. Is mommy coming home? Tae-Joon checked the magazine of his pistol with a rhythmic, lethal click. He looked at her, his expression serious and intense. Stay in the closet, Ha-Eun. Don't come out until you hear my voice. I'm going to end this. The penthouse door hissed shut, locking with a finality that echoed through the empty hallway. Tae-Joon stepped into the private elevator, his reflection in the polished steel revealing a man who had shed the skin of a businessman to reveal the bone of a warlord. He pulled out his primary encrypted radio and keyed the channel that only 6 men in the city could hear. Code Black, he said, his voice a low, terrifying growl. This isn't a collection. It isn't a territory grab. We are hunting for a ghost, and the ghost has a name, Rosa Martinez. Across the city, the machinery of Tae-Joon's empire shifted with violent precision. This wasn't the slow, methodical work of loan sharks or protection racketeers. This was a scorched earth sweep. In the neon-drenched alleys of the red light district, enforcers who usually moved like shadows now kicked down doors with the force of a hurricane. They didn't ask for tribute. They showed a photo of a woman in a chef's coat and a sketch of a man in a black mask. Where is she? Was the only question asked. If the answer wasn't immediate, the consequences were permanent. At the docks, 3 black SUVs screeched to a halt, spilling out men in tactical gear who moved with military synchronization. They bypassed the usual smuggling routes and headed straight for the safe houses General O had managed. They weren't there to negotiate. They were there to eliminate every witness to the betrayal. One by one, O's loyalists were neutralized, their screams muffled by the lapping waves against the pier. Back in the sedan, Tae-Joon watched the data stream in on his tablet. His men were dismantling the Silent Hands infrastructure piece by piece. A warehouse in the north was burned to the ground. A private clinic used by mercenaries was seized. The message was being sent in blood. Anyone who had touched the girl's mother had forfeited their right to exist in Tae-Joon City. Chairman, his lead enforcer's voice crackled over the comms. We found the driver of the white van. He talked. They're at the old iron foundry, just like O said. But there's a second team moving toward your penthouse. They aren't waiting for the exchange. Tae-Joon's eyes darkened, a calm but dangerous aura radiating from him. He knew now that the call had been a diversion to pull him away from Ha-Eun. O wanted the witness dead and the chairman broken. "Intercept the team at the penthouse," Tae-Joon commanded, his grip tightening on his .45. "Leave no one alive. I'll handle the foundry myself." He looked out at the silhouette of the iron foundry rising against the moonlit sky like a rusted tomb. He was walking into a trap, and he knew it. But for the first time in 15 years, Kang Tae-Joon wasn't fighting for power. He was fighting for a promise made to a child in a pink dress. The iron foundry was a cathedral of rust and shadows, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and industrial decay. High above the floor, suspended over a vat of bubbling chemical waste, sat Rosa Martinez. She was bound and gagged, her eyes frantic as she watched the silhouettes of armed men moving in the rafters. General O stood on the catwalk, his silhouette framed by the sickly yellow glow of the factory lights. He looked down at the lone figure walking through the center of the foundry. Tae-Joon moved with a slow, deliberate cadence, his black suit a shadow against the grime. He carried no rifle, no shield, just the heavy, commanding presence of a man who had already accepted his fate. "Stop right there, Tae-Joon!" O shouted, his voice echoing off the corrugated metal walls. "Where is the girl?" Tae-Joon stopped, looking up at his old friend with an expression of intense, clinical calm. "She's exactly where you can't touch her, oh! Hidden behind a door you'll never open." O's face twisted in a sneer. He signaled his men, and 3 red laser dots appeared on Tae-Joon's chest. "Then you've signed her mother's death warrant. And yours." "I don't think so," Tae-Joon said, his voice a low, lethal vibration. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, amber-colored vial. "You recognize this?" "VX4. Military grade. The same batch you used to dust my dinner." O laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "What are you going to do? Throw it at me from 40 feet away?" "I don't have to," Tae-Joon replied. He looked toward the ventilation system, where a single, silent drone, deployed by his men minutes earlier, was perched atop the intake fans. "I've spent 15 years learning how you think, O. You always prepare for the front door, but you forget the air you breathe." Before O could react, Tae-Joon crushed the vial under his heel and stepped back into a pressurized clean zone he'd identified behind a heavy blast door. Simultaneously, the drone dropped a secondary canister into the intake. The colorless, odorless mist surged through the vents. Panic erupted on the catwalk. The guards gasped, clutching their throats as the nerve agent took hold with surgical speed. General O stumbled, his legs buckling. He collapsed onto the rusted grate, his vision blurring as Tae-Joon emerged from the shadows, stepping onto the catwalk with a gas mask snapped over his features. Tae-Joon stood over the dying traitor, watching the light fade from O's eyes. He didn't use a bullet. He let the general experience the very final course he had prepared for his chairman. "Business is business, O," Tae-Joon whispered, his voice muffled by the mask. "But the girl, she was personal." He turned away from the dying man and ran toward the crane controls. With a few sharp movements of the lever, he lowered the platform holding Rosa Martinez. As her feet touched the solid ground, Tae-Joon cut her ties with a single, swift motion. She collapsed into his arms, sobbing, her terror finally breaking. "Sophie, my daughter!" she gasped. "She's safe," Tae-Joon said, his voice softening. "And the Shadow Man is gone." The morning sun crept over the city skyline, casting long, golden fingers through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse. For the first time in years, the space didn't feel like a cold sanctuary of glass and steel. It smelled of toasted bread and warm milk. Tae-Joon stood at the kitchen island, his broad shoulders relaxed, his sharp jawline slightly softened as he watched Ha-Eun eat. She was back in her pink dress, her light brown braids neatly redone by her mother, who was currently working the stove with a quiet, peaceful focus. Rosa Martinez had returned to her world, but the world was no longer the same. The shadows that used to haunt the corners of the kitchen were gone, replaced by a pair of silent, well-dressed men standing guard at the service entrance. They weren't there to intimidate. They were there to ensure that this shadow man would never be more than a fading nightmare. "Mr. Lion," Ha-Eun whispered, her cheeks full of breakfast. She looked up at Tae-Joon with those same large, curious eyes that had saved his life. "Are you still a bad guy?" Tae-Joon paused, a faint, rare smile touching his lips. He reached out and gently patted her head, his large hand nearly covering her entire crown. "I'm whatever I need to be to keep this table safe, Ha-Eun." The internal audit had been absolute. The traitors were gone, and the organization had been purged with surgical precision. But the biggest change wasn't in the ledgers or the territory maps. It was in the rule that now governed the East Side. Everyone knew it. The kitchen staff were untouchable. To touch a chef was to invite the dragon's personal wrath. As Rosa placed a steaming bowl of noodles in front of Tae-Joon, she caught his eye. No words were needed. She had seen the monster in the foundry, but she had also seen the man who carried her daughter through a battlefield. She leaned in, her voice a soft murmur of gratitude. "You didn't have to do any of this." "I had a debt," Tae-Joon replied, his voice a low rumble of conviction. "And in my world, we always pay our debts." Life returned to a new kind of normal. Ha-Eun went back to school, her small backpack filled with notebooks and a pink sweater. But every afternoon, a black sedan waited at the curb. Not to evoke fear, but to provide a shield. Every year on the anniversary of the poison dinner, Tae-Joon would find a small, hand-drawn picture on his desk, usually of a lion and a small girl sharing a meal. He had spent 15 years building a throne of fear, only to realize that the strongest fortress he ever built was the one surrounding a 7-year-old girl. Kang Tae-Joon was still a man of shadows, but now, he made sure the sun always shone on the Martinez family.